Bitte über Platz nehmen.
Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Laura von Allwörden will defend the academic thesis, Contestation-Legitimation Processes in Global Climate Governance, International Organizations and the Guiding Norm of Climate Change Action. May I please invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Yes, thank you very much. Dear Dean, dear highly esteemed opposition, dear supervisors, dear colleagues, dear friends and family. I'm very delighted and grateful to be here today to be able to present to you my dissertation research entitled Contestation, Legitimation Processes in Global Climate Governance, International Organizations and the Guiding Norm of Climate Change Action. We are counting the years, 2020, 2021, 22, 23. This world is in crisis. We have the pandemic crisis, Ukraine crisis, energy crisis, and the climate crisis. I started my PhD research in these times of crisis, finalized it in times of crisis, and I researched a crisis. In my dissertation research, I asked questions about how social actors navigate themselves and their interaction in this indisputably most existential crisis humankind ever had to face. Climate change is a global issue, and its effects will continue to rise around the globe. It is clear that acting on climate change together and now is the imperative of our time. Climate change as crisis not only challenges multilateralism and global governance, but our all livelihood. It is also clear global climate change action is not just a catchphrase, but became the norm for the global cooperation towards this crisis. Thus, the spotlight is not only on national actors, but also on energy and environmental international organizations in the global climate regime. Yet at the same time, contestations are multiplying and seemingly more evident and inevitable than ever. For example, in 2017, when former US President Donald Trump called climate change mythical, non-existent, and the Paris Agreement an expensive hoax, and announced to withdraw the US from the agreement. The rise of contestation in the system of global governance and the complexity of climate change itself creates a fragile realm for international organizations and puts them in a permanent struggle for their legitimacy. For international organizations, contestations can have several consequences, all of which can result in delegitimation, which can even lead to a crisis of legitimacy. In fact, in the past, within the global climate regime, there were several instances of contestation that were followed by delegitimation. For example, the failure of the US non-ratification of the Kyoto Protocol in 2001, or as we have now with the Energy Charter Treaty, from which several members are about to withdraw. However, what can also be empirically observed is that despite several instances of contestation, some international organizations neither experience delegitimation nor a crisis of legitimacy. To pick up the example of the Trump withdrawal, this contestation by a major power was in fact met with fierce legitimation of the agreement by member states and non-state actors. How can this be explained? Why does contestation in certain cases lead to legitimation of international organizations in the global climate governance regime? This is the question I ask in my research. As I argue, contestation and legitimation are connected in a holistic process. I argue that climate change action as the norm frames these processes in the global climate regime, as norms represent the legitimating core of global governance and are considered as standards of appropriate behavior in international relations. In the following, I will speak about what the international relations literature has been missing and what I do thereof on a conceptual level, and how I proceeded in my research. I will talk about my cases, my four analyzed processes, and my findings, the norm of climate change action, and finally, the scientific and societal implications of my research. In the international relations literature, we see that there are two camps that only marginally addressed the direct relationship of contestation and legitimation, although there is a vast scholarship that addresses legitimation and contestation separately. Legitimation scholars such as Jonas Thalberg, Michael Zürn, Karin Beckstrand, or Tobias Lenz have scarcely asked what this legitimation is really informed by, so on a normative, cultural level. Further, they have understood legitimation thus far in connection with merely legitimacy and its crisis. Contestation is used as an underdeveloped term by legitimation scholars, and no weight has been given to contestation as a concept in regard to investigated legitimation. While to the contrary, norm contestation scholars such as Antje Wiener, Nicole Deitelhoff, or Lisbeth Zimmermann have engaged in a critical conversation about norm contestation, and although contestation's positive legitimizing effect and the related legitimacy gap has been acknowledged, few have gone beyond the space of norms themselves and actively engaged with other social entities, such as international organizations. Michael Zürn, for example, has engaged in discussing the legitimacy, authority, and contestation of international institutions, but basically only looks at the different effects on IOs after contestation as different forms of delegitimation. But what I'm interested in is how these processes work and what guides them. I'm aiming to answer why legitimation can follow contestation. Hence, I connect the different theoretical concepts. I understand contestation as a practice of refusal, criticism, or objection that signals a legitimacy gap, while delegitimation as the practice of depreciation or disapproving is a processual engagement after contestation. And while delegitimation entails depreciation, the practice of legitimation refers to a justification intended to shape legitimacy beliefs, which enables and manifests legitimacy. To answer my research question, I analyzed and compared two influential cases of international organizations in the global climate regime: the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the International Energy Agency, the IEA. The two organizations have been contested multiple times in the past, as they are at the heart of the global cooperation on climate change. In the global climate regime, contestation focused on the two key issues of the North-South divide and the institutional format for climate governance. To do this, I conducted more than 40 interviews with IO staff, state negotiators, and other stakeholders, such as non-state actors, that are involved in the respective IO processes. Additionally, I engaged in a vast document analysis of first and secondary literature, as well as speeches and other documents. I was also able to conduct participant observation at the COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. I traced the occurring practices of the contestation legitimation processes. This way, I engaged in an altered form of process tracing. My approach of practice tracing allowed interpretive analysis in an abductive manner to be able to deconstruct the processes, the related practices, and their meaning in use, so the guiding norm. For the two cases, I deconstructed two processes per IO. The UNFCCC's first process was the walkout of the G77 countries at the Warsaw COP19 in 2013. The contestation was at the heart of the North-South divide. The UNFCCC succeeded in relegitimating COP19 and its negotiation, despite the contesting walkouts. The norm of climate change action frames the overall process and thus conditioned the legitimation after contestation. The second process was the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement by former President Trump in 2017. Here, it was anticipated that a domino effect of further contestation and other members withdrawing from the agreement will follow. Yet, several members of the UNFCCC and several sub-state and non-state actors on a US level opposed Trump's position and engaged in different kinds of legitimation practices, supporting and emphasizing the importance of the agreement, the UNFCCC, and climate change action. I find that this process, too, is conditioned by the frame of the climate change action norm. Here, especially my interview data, the literature, as well as my COP participation, support my findings. For the IEA, I identified two processes of contestation legitimation that manifested in the creation of the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, in 2009. This counter-institution was in fact created by 3 IEA member states. In the first process, the non-inclusivity of the IEA's membership of only OECD countries was contested. This non-universal frame meant the neglect of including rising powers, such as China and India, that have greatly increased their energy consumption over time. The second process is the contestation of the exclusion of the IEA's renewable energy. This stood in tension to the reality of climate change and the demand to transition to more sustainable energy sources. Its focus on oil only did not reflect the changing realities of its member states and the demands of a changing world. I find that the IEA engaged in self-legitimation practices and was able to come back as the most suitable organization to organize the energy policy field. In response to both contestations, the IEA legitimated itself by incorporating the association membership of non-OECD countries, as well as transitioning its expertise to all energy sources beyond fossil energy only. My findings are particularly supported by my interviews with IEA and IRENA staff and negotiators, as well as by original documents. All of these 4 processes show that contestation can lead to legitimation. By understanding contestation legitimation as a holistic process, and by deconstructing the practices of contestation and legitimation to the 2 core aspects of the norm, I can detect the different stages of norm-internalization of the parts of the respective communities. This internalization informs the contestation practice, as well as the legitimation practice after contestation. At the same time, of course, normativization is never final, as norms are themselves contestable, but the internalization shows us where the relevant community in the process is at with their understanding of the norm at a particular point in time. As I argue, the norm of climate change action as guiding principle structures behavior, determines the legitimacy belief of the community, and conditions the process as a guiding frame. The norm of climate change action can be broken down to its 2 core aspects, the collective endeavor aspect and the aspect of policy implementation. The norm of climate change action speaks to the stronger, more ambitious mobilization and implementation of policies and action by all global actors to fight climate change. My research has several scientific and societal implications. First, on a conceptual level, my findings provide new insights into the connection between contestation and legitimation. Second, by combining the 2 cases of the large international organizations, the UNFCCC and the IEA, a broader view and at the same time a deeper connection between the 2 issue areas, energy and environment, in the global climate regime has been made. By identifying them as part of the wider global climate regime under the umbrella of the climate change action norm, I am also able to make a novel empirical contribution. Third, by showing that climate change action became the norm, I also add a novel finding to our understanding of global climate governance. And fourth and finally, also for practitioners in the global climate regime, my research has important implications. Most importantly, it shows norms matter. We need to realize that normative changes have practical implications. Normative change means practical change. In practice, conscious awareness about the normative implications of political processes can strengthen the ability of practitioners to navigate their organization through contestation and to better manage this existential crisis of climate change. And it shall also remind us of our own part in climate change action as collective endeavor. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very clear and succinct presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Sophie van Honacker, Professor of Administrative Governance at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, dear Laura, first of all, my sincere congratulations with a very well written piece of work, also very well researched and original. I think your combination of these two clusters of literature on legitimation, contestation works very well and leads to some very interesting new insights. And I think you also did a good job in operationalizing the processes of contestation and legitimation. My question is, well, about one of the recommendations you made in the thesis, and you also briefly referred to it at the end of your presentation. And you said that institutional formats governing the global climate regime require adaptation. And you suggest that policymakers need to speak more to the common understanding of what is appropriate and necessary. Mm-hmm. And I assume that you then mean that you have to bring it more in line with the CCE norm, which takes such an important role in your thesis. So could you elaborate a little bit more on how this could happen in practice? And then secondly, related to this, you also make the point very well in your thesis that norms are not static and they may evolve. And also norm internalization is never final, you say. And I would like to make a link with the changing geopolitical context. And because you know that there are growing tensions between the big players like the US and China, and this could also perhaps negatively impact on the norm of the CCA and perhaps undermine it. So could you also give your reflections on this?
Yes, thank you very much for that great question, highly esteemed opponent. To your first question, I would like to zoom out a little bit to the climate regime we currently have and we could have witnessed in the past years, decades even. So the institutional format we have now that is governing, or the governing agreement, is the Paris Agreement. What we often see every year at the COPs that the UNFCCC facilitates is that climate justice and the North-South divide, that is actually the key issue that is addressed in questions about climate justice, is also addressing the institutional format of the Paris Agreement. What I mean by this is that when practitioners are negotiating the issue of climate justice is reoccurring and reoccurring. And this way, which also might answer a bit to your second question, the norm of climate change action needs to really, in practice, be implemented on these lines of climate justice, the issues it speaks to, as well as its two core aspects, which also speak to the two key issues we have in the global climate regimes when contestations arise, the collective endeavor aspect and the policy implementation aspect. And what we often see is that, well, everybody has ratified the Paris Agreement, but the aspect of policy implementation for climate action is still lacking on the issue of the North-South divide, which then translates into conflicts about climate justice. For the second question, and I have to say, I thought I would have a pen here, so I couldn't take notes. This is why I'm also a bit. Thank you so much. I'm sorry about this.
Shall I repeat it?
Can you? I know it's about normativization, but I don't remember which aspect it was. Sorry.
Yeah. No, and it's indeed, as you said, there is a link between the first and the second part of the questions, because in your thesis you make the point that norms are not static, so that they the guiding principles may change, and norm internalization is never final. And I then would like to make a link between with the changing geopolitical context and. It may well be that, or would you expect that the changing geopolitical context and the growing tensions between big players like the US and China may actually negatively impact on the norm of CCA and perhaps even undermine it?
So the problem with China that is reoccurring and that also has been reoccurring in the past years, especially in Copenhagen in 2009, we see when the COP, the negotiations broke down also, and also what you could read in the book at the G77 walkout in 2013. China is, as we all know now, a major power that still is part of the G77 country group, which consists of lesser developed countries. So in the global climate negotiations, China always takes the position of the leader of these lesser developed global south countries, which, if we look at the collective endeavor aspect of the norm of climate change action, we could say, well, actually, this is then a good thing that we have a powerful country supporting countries that are not as powerful in the global climate regime in all kinds of ways, development, resources, in the negotiations, input they can give, but also what they can implement at home. But on the other hand, China, of course, is now a major power, a major emitter, economically stronger than it has been decades ago. And so in the global climate regime, this position China takes is highly contested by major powers from the global north. The conflict most often occurs between the US and China, which we see COP and COP again, that China and the US are conflicting about exactly this issue of China still being or is interpreting for itself to be in a position of a lesser developed country, thus has to pay less, fund less, and to circle back, what does it mean for the norm? Well, if we would aim for really an appropriate translation of the norm in practice, we wouldn't have these problems because everybody would be pulling on the same rope, and negotiators would aim lesser for the interests of a country, for example, as China, who could very well be taken more responsible for acting on climate change, but that is actually not, because it's still in the alleged role of a lesser developed country. So this is, in a way, a weakening to the norm, at the same time a strong country leading the G77 group for the collective endeavor aspect of the norm can very well be a positive aspect for strengthening the norm. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by online by Dr. Carmen Wunderlich, Assistant Professor with the Chair of International Relations and Development Policy at the University of Duisburg-Essen.
Thank you very much, dear candidate, dear Laura. It's my pleasure to having read your PhD thesis, and many congratulations to that very interesting work. So your work does not only deal with one of the most pressing problems of our time, namely the governance of global climate change, but also with a recent debate in the field of norm research, namely the question what lends norm stability, even though they are subject to constant and continuous contestation. And you already said that you seek to answer that question by linking two strands of the literature, namely legitimation and norm contestation. And what you do is you also bridge the norms research with regard to a more static understanding that has been proposed by the more classical models such as the norm life cycle and the concept of norm internalization with more modern or critical concepts such as the concept of norm contestation. And I found that to be very interesting. And my question relates to the choice of concepts, namely how norm contestation actually speaks to norm internalization. Because norm internalization, as you already said, is a bit like in contrast to a norm being in constant flux and being contested all the way down. So how can a norm that is contested and reinterpreted be stable at the same time? So why did you choose norm internalization? How do you define norm internalization? And perhaps also with regard to the community of actors that you see in your very interesting cases, what does that mean? Yeah, I would be interested to if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes, thank you very much for that great question, dear esteemed opponent. Let me start by saying this. What I also stress in my book is that the conceptual underpinnings of contestation by norm contestation scholars can very well be applied in a better way also to other social entities, such as international organizations. Why do I do this? Of course, these other entities, international organizations, agreements, also practices, of course, build on normative underpinnings. They have normative guidance. But what my problem was empirically, we see that it's not explicitly a norm that is most often contested, but the format that transports this norm. And for me, this entails other wider implications than just zooming in the norm. And my second question was in showing how contestation and legitimation are linked. And as I find in my research, the norm, as they are also standards of appropriate behavior and structure this behavior in international relations, can actually guide these processes of contestation legitimation, because these processes, of course, build on normative underpinnings. So I very well see that you could argue, well, but in the end, isn't it the norm that is itself contested? I would say if you zoom in on the empirical reality of the processes, which you also have when you look at the connection between contestation and legitimation, for example, in the case of the G77 walkout, the norm hasn't been contested with the walkout. What was actually being done is, well, we need to reinforce more collective action. We need to have a policy that is actually better applicable to translate this climate change action that we need on a just level. So the contestation actually promoted the norm, if you want to use that term. And then in the legitimation, the community, which in that case was the UNFCCC, also in the negotiating process, needed to bring parties back together and to actually negotiate and have negotiators negotiate an agreement that speaks more to these aspects of the norm. Why did I choose normativization, although Antje Wiener, for example, highly criticizes this static understanding of norm, the life of norms. As I also said in the book, it's, I would say, the life cycle never ends. So if you take the old model they have, you could add, well, but there is a reinterpretation of the norm that reoccurs and reoccurs, such as we also, as people, change. Change is inevitable. And this way, I would also agree with Antje Wiener that norm interpretation is flexible because it is in flux, but at the same time, at some point in time, norms guide behavior because they are stable, because they give the background knowledge that practitioners access when they contest or legitimate these contestation legitimation processes. I could go on, but I hope this in a way answers your question.
Thanks.
For the second round, maybe, if we have one.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Thomas Sommerer, Chair for Political Science, especially International Organizations at the University of Potsdam.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, dear Laura, thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to start by also commending you for your attempt of bringing together these broad literatures on contestation and legitimation. I think that it's really a gap, and you really make a valuable contribution here. My question is also related to this nexus between contestation and legitimation. I would like to know if and how the level of legitimacy, or if you want the size of a potential legitimacy deficit, matters for this transition from contestation to positive legitimation.
Yes, dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that question. May I just ask a question back? The level of legitimacy of what exactly? The organization, or what is being contested in the process?
Of the organization, of the IO, be it the UNFCCC, the EIA.
I would say yes. Levels of legitimacy always influence these processes. When we look at the IAA, at the point in time, the IAA actually had a lower level of legitimacy when it actually came to the creation of the counter-institution of IRENA in 2009. Because when we think about it, for member states, it can be highly expensive to create a new institution that involves costs, and then you could ask, well, but why did they not just change the format? Why did they not just change the membership clauses? That would have been less expensive at the time. But because of these very strong, also legally binding, that legally strong binding format of the oil emergency response mechanism in the IEA, and also the OECD only membership of the IEA, were so highly legally institutionalized that the three IEA member states, Denmark, Germany, and Spain, Denmark and Germany also had economical interests in pushing for renewables and offshore wind energy, but that's just a side note. They didn't think that this really highly institutionalized, legally binding format of the IEA was worth it, and it was not appropriate to change this, so they needed a new organization, which speaks to a lower level of legitimacy of the IEA at the time. So it actually highly mattered in how strong the IEA would respond to the contestation, and how strongly they would engage in legitimation practices that speak to the demands of the contestation, and thus speak to the demands of the climate change action norm that was actually also here promoted, that was asked for being enforced with the contestation of the IRENA creation. So with that example, I would say yes, legitimacy from the starting point matters in a way, because it also speaks to the ability of the IO to perform and respond, or even in the case of the IEA, of how heavily they have to engage and make it work to re-legitimate themselves. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Ana Herranz-Surales, Associate Professor in International Relations, also at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Maastricht.
Dear doctoral candidate, dear Laura, congratulations on this achievement. I really liked reading the book. I very much like the ambition, but also conviction with which you discuss these two main bodies of literature in IR, but also how you advance your own model to connect the two. Also, this is nicely done in the constructivist tradition by using practice theory and this abductive method. But my question maybe builds on that, because somehow with your research question, you fall a little bit into a rationalist camp when asking, why contestation turns into legitimation, maybe instead of why. And that somehow leads the reader to wonder why then the case selection did not contribute that much to that explaining in details of why did maybe you didn't choose cases with a different outcome. You mentioned the ECT in your presentation and also in your thesis, but also why not cases with different norms? Here we could think of OPEC, also driven by certain norms, certainly not climate action. So to recap, could you say more about the logics of case selection, selecting similar cases, institutions, norms, and an outcome, or why didn't you tap more into the variety of cases in the field?
Thank you very much, dear esteemed opponent, for that great question. And I'm happy to answer that by circling back a bit to what actually started this research. We went into, because my dissertation is also part of our NESTIO project on the death and decline of international organizations. So starting this PhD, the framing was to look into IOs that might or that have experienced decline. Also, we wanted to look at large international organizations, which the UNFCCC and the IEA are, so that we actually see a wider network of variety of actors that also engage in the processes of these IOs. So when I looked into the global climate regime to find cases that I could research in my dissertation, the UNFCCC, with the just recently happened contestation by Donald Trump, was a starting point to look at. Because you would expect, and this is also what I write in my book, that contestation, the original understanding of contestation as practice of criticism, refusal, objection, actually has negative consequences. So we would always see contestation leading, first of all, to delegitimation. But what we can actually see in the Trump case is that contestation was directly followed by legitimation. Delegitimation was not even the case, because it was directly met with fierce legitimation by mentioned member states and non-state actors. And this I found surprising, because we would expect contestation would lead to delegitimation, to a then decline of the IO. But this didn't happen. And when we look into the other cases that I researched, of course you could argue, well, but wouldn't you say that there is a in-between step between this contestation and legitimation you map out for the IEA, for example? But then I was wondering, okay, but what is guiding these processes of contestation by major powers, creating a counter-institution that can highly negatively affect the original IO? And what I found was that the normative guidance, so the why the contestation is followed by legitimation and not delegitimation, and then we just see a decline and nothing. These are the normative underpinnings that guide these processes. So I also elaborated on that earlier. When we see the contestation in the G77 walkout, actually climate change action is promoted positively. So the UNFCCC regime that is working to make collective climate change action on a global level work, that is actually benefiting the purpose of the IO. So it's not a contestation of the UNFCCC and the normative guidance and the norm, but it is actually a promotion of what the UNFCCC is here to do. And this was also surprising, because we have a contestation, but it was positively affecting the UNFCCC. So for me, the natural coming question is, why does contestation, although we would expect differently, not lead to legitimation? And maybe also to answer a bit more on a methodological level about the two cases and why I did not include negative cases is to answer exactly this, because you mentioned the ECT. We have several cases for international organizations, but also in the global climate regime, where contestation actually has these negative effects. And the UNFCCC and IEA, I also write this in the book, are influential cases. So if you would take them away from the sample, our understanding of contestation being able to lead to legitimation would not be as profound as we have it when we include the UNFCCC and the IEA in this sample, because with the large organizations, we have several instances where contestation was in fact met by legitimation. And this is why because I wanted to really zoom into answering this question, why I did not include a negative case. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, no, maybe a short follow-up. Would your model explain also negative cases of where legitimation failed? Just to be a little bit more, clear.
Mm-hmm. And here is where the normativization comes in. If, and I write this also in the book, if the contestation claim is not met with the normative underpinnings, so if the legitimation doesn't cater to what is being contested in the internalization cycle. Okay, this is now I would need to draw something, but I can't. So let me maybe start over again by making it less complicated. Yes, my model could also answer these cases of contestation leading to just delegitimation, because then we would have to zoom into the internalization and what the contestation actually speaks to, or what the contestation actually contests, and how the legitimation meets these contestation claims. I think this is more clear. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Francesca Colli, Assistant Professor in European Politics, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, dear Laura, firstly, congratulations on this very nice piece of work. And as you mentioned, it was a very turbulent time when you started and wrote this. And I think congratulations on pulling off the interviews and the participant observations in a difficult time to get access to these IOs. My question builds a little bit on what you touched on in your answer to the previous question. So in your book, you write also that one of the differences is that indeed this CCA norm is at the heart of the UNFCCC and not so much in the IEA. And one of the things, and so this changes the outcome or the kind of contestation legitimation that happens. And one of the things that we see is an increasing mainstreaming of climate action into other policy areas. So my question is, with this increasing idea that climate action should be in other areas as well, what can we say about how this might play out in IOs that don't have climate change at the core of their mandates? Things like IOs in development, migration, human rights. In other words, what happens when the norm is not at the heart of the mandate of the IO, and how does this affect contestation and the legitimization processes that occur?
Yes, thank you very much, esteemed opponent, for that great question. I think we already have been seeing what you're aiming at with your questions in the past when we talk about climate security, the climate security nexus, which means that climate change is not only a soft politics issue anymore that needs to be implemented only in marginal extent on national level and on global level, but it actually speaks to climate change affecting the security of human lives. We have migration from countries that are highly affected by climate change already. We have droughts, floods, last year parallelly to COP27, we had the floods right before in Pakistan. And this way, climate change is not a niche issue of IOs in the energy and environmental sector, but, and as you also implied with your question, it is mainstreaming into the issues other IOs need to cover. This can also, and this I don't know for a fact, but if we go a bit further in the future, climate security means also energy security. It means geopolitical security. With the invasion in the Ukraine, we have the energy crisis now. Although the conflict itself is about geopolitical issues, yet again, it affects how energy policy needs to be changed, implemented, and this is not only highly concerning the IEA, for example, but also IOs with broad mandates, such as the EU. And as I said, I don't know for a fact if this is the case, but I could also think that in the future, also security IOs, such as NATO, need to pay attention to issues of climate change, as we have migration as a security issue, as we have energy as a security issue, and this is why I can very well imagine the norm of climate change action actually mainstreaming even more into all fields of IOs. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. You've been so succinct that we have time for a second round. And I will now give the screen again to Dr. Carmen Wunderlich, yes, who will ask you a second question. And Laura, if you could switch off your microphone, because sometimes there's an echo. You just have to, yeah. Yeah, and then when you speak, you put it on again, and I will also.
Thanks. Yeah, so my second question touches a bit about your methods, because I found it quite interesting that you use the method of practice tracing, and you just said a little bit about that. I would like you to elaborate a bit more on the rationale for choosing that method as compared to other methods that you could have chosen, such as interpretive methods of qualitative content analysis, for example. And perhaps you could also go on and tell us a little bit about the pitfalls, the challenges that you encountered with regard to practice tracing, and the advice you would give to your fellow or other future PhD students if they would do practice tracing as well.
Yes, thank you, esteemed opponent, for that great second question. Why did I choose practice tracing? As I also write in the book, when zooming into the practices, I'm able to deconstruct them to what guides them. So the guiding norm of climate change action in that case. Practices in the practice theoretical literature are defined as competent performances that are guided by background knowledge. This background knowledge consists of different layers that also involves norms, identity, cultural values also being one of them. But this background knowledge is actually guiding the practice. Practices, of course, can be habitual at some point in time, but they can also change when contestation comes in and demands this change, also being able to re-legitimate. And for me, why I didn't choose other methods, this being able with this understanding of practices and being able to deconstruct them in that manner that I do, and being able to have interpretive analytical tools when deconstructing them, I find that we can actually answer questions why legitimation is occurring after contestation, because we are able to find the core aspects of the normative guidance of the norm, which for me by being able to zoom in so much into the practices, what is actually being said, what is actually being done, enables this unveiling of the norm. What I would recommend for fellow PhDs, if they choose to do practice tracing, is to bring a lot of time and a lot of going back and triangulating their data. Because just brushing over something that is being said or being done without having an understanding of also the context in which these practices occur. The Trump example, we had the election. It was anticipated that something with Trump and the Paris Agreement would happen that actually also prepared the UNFCCC for the process. And when we also then look at the practices, the legitimation practices, member states and non-state actors engage in, these speak highly in a discursive but also behavioral manner to supporting the agreement, and they actually speak explicitly to climate change action. So again, bringing some time and some patience and some patience to go back into the data is something that I would recommend for my fellow PhDs if they choose to use this practice tracing method.
Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Sommerer.
Thank you very much. It's nice to have a chance for a second question. I would like to turn away from methodology and focus on the generalizability of the results from your project. If you think of the climate change action norm as a norm, what would you say in terms of the characteristics of that norm that speak in favor of or against the chances of generalizing from your results on the contestation-legitimation nexus in this project?
Yes, thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for that excellent and also rather complex question. Because, of course, but then I'm bringing in the methodological level again, when you choose to zoom in so much on specific processes that happen at a particular point in time with particular practices, of course, questions about generalizability arise. Because we would think, well, but this is maybe then more a trend that is that might fade away, that reinterpretation of this might occur in a way that climate change action does not matter anymore. But when we look into the harsh empirical reality, I say, and what I also said before when answering the question about what the norm of climate change action might mean to other IOs and other policy fields, I would say the norm of CCA is highly in favor for generalizability of other contestation legitimation processes. When we have in the migration regime contestation happening that is about having collective policies about how migration, because of climate change, can be improved. I don't know if this is the best word for it, but if we can actually have a better regime for it, the norm of climate change action and its two core aspects of policy implementation and as a collective endeavor actually highly speak to other cases as well. And I know your question, or I'm not sure if your question also went into that direction, if the model itself of contestation leading to legitimation guided by a frame of a specific norm. This, I would say, is highly applicable to other cases as well and highly generalizable as well, because we have contestation in all policy fields and legitimation and delegitimation as a necessity to respond to contestation. And as we know, if contestation is not answered, in case this will not be good for the IO or the contested target in the end. But I hope this answers your question to some extent.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Colli. No, I jumped. I'm sorry. sorry. Just seeing if you pay attention. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Anna Herranz-Surales.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also had another question on norms, but now, also maybe building on the last question. You mentioned in your thesis that this is one part of the explanation to your puzzle, but that there could also be alternative explanations. These, for example, the role of big secretariat or these being multi-purpose organizations, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about what could other factors be relevant for that, and also for the generalizability.
Thank you, dear esteemed opponent, for that great question, and I'm happy to answer it by saying you need to ask other questions if you want to know what other factors are affecting the contestation and the legitimation. For example, in the Trump example, of course you can say, well, we have a major power, but Trump was not very popular in the international realm with his other fellow leaders of other member states. This then, of course, can also be an explanation to why this legitimation was so fierce and so opposing and so directly directed towards Trump. And then you could say, well, maybe it's just human sympathy. Also, you could say, well, when we have the IEA cases, the member states are actually the ones that matter most, that states' interests matter most in why legitimation occurs or not. But then we have IRENA, and this seems to be the thing member states wanted to go for at the time, and they didn't want to change the IEA. But then we actually see that the IEA has agency to self-legitimate, to re-legitimate. But then if we ask what is actually guiding this legitimation, the practices, the practical response to the contestation, then we need to turn to what the guidance is on a normative level, which informs the practices. But of course, and as I also write in the book, you may very well argue that state interests, and also when you have such an ideological president as Trump, there will be other factors that influence why the legitimation, for example, was so fierce. I hope this answers the question.
Now we come to Dr. Colli.
Yes, thank you. My second question is also about the norm. So you define the norm based on the UNFCCC document with these two elements of collective endeavor and policy implementation. And I just was wondering whether you think this influences your results in any way, because obviously the UNFCCC is also one of the IOs that you represent, so in some sense it might be natural, let's say, that they have internalized the norm that was also reflected in their documents. So my question digs deeper into how you operationalize this norm, whether you considered any other sources, and if you think that has implications for what you found actually about the role of the norm in the process, of contestation legitimation. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much, dear esteemed opponent, for that question. And I hope I'm understanding it correctly, that what you're saying basically is, well, for the UNFCCC, then it was easy to re-legitimate because they are at the core of the climate regime that actually also promotes climate change action. But for the IEA, not so much the case. When we zoom into the contestation that actually demands what we have in the case of the IEA, that actually demands turning to climate change action, then
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
please leave the microphone on.
Laura van Allwörden, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Dijkstra is now authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Laura van Allwörden, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by law and custom. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
It's yours.
Yeah, you can come to the front. Take the time.
Prorector, honorable members of the committee, colleagues and students, family and friends, dear Dr. Laura van Allwörden. You've done it. Congratulations. It's over. Laura, we met for the first time in July 2019. It was the midst of the summer. My holidays were about a week away, and we still had to fill that final spot in our ERC team for a PhD candidate specializing in the environment and energy. Now, you came to that interview and you left a lasting impression. You gave us a very nice presentation of your master thesis, and I think the one thing that really convinced me and I was impressed by was the master thesis you attached to your application. And I have some master theses which are a bit short, but this was a decent piece of work, everybody. Conceptual, theoretically, empirically strong. And I thought if you can write that, you can certainly write a PhD thesis. Now, there was one thing that I was slightly worried about. And that was whether we could really actually start on the 1st of September. I mean, we had the interview mid-July, it was 6 weeks away, and I was quite keen to have the whole team, our whole research team, start on the same date, because, we were supposed to be a team, right? Now, we all know that the housing market in Maastricht is sometimes difficult before the start of the academic year. So I told you, Laura, it might be difficult. I didn't know Laura back then well. Within a week, Laura had found herself an apartment in the Brusselse Straat, I think, right next to the faculty. Literally the colleague living next to the faculty. So I think that was really Laura. And I'm telling you this anecdote because I think it has also been a real nice analogy of how you approached your PhD. you wrote your PhD in 3.5 years, almost as quickly as you found an apartment here in Maastricht. You took on the challenge with rigor and you saw it through. And I think that's really an accomplishment that you managed to do that so quickly, but also I think with the book that you've presented to us here today. Now I do want to say a couple of words about your book. And it really is a book. I mean, there's great rigor, I think, in terms of how you approached it. And you identified yourself from the beginning as I'm a practice scholar, I'm a practice theorist, and I want to also bring that to the project. And by doing this, I don't think you always made your own life easier in terms of doing the research, but you were clearly motivated to contribute to these intellectual theoretical debates in your discipline. So not just say something about climate change and about energy, but also about legitimation and contestation. Now for us as your supervisors, Professor Dr. Esther Versluis and myself, this also provided some intellectual stimulus. You know, we weren't necessarily versed in the academic literature, so we had to navigate the contestation and legitimation literature together with you. And I think that was quite a journey, but I think we are very satisfied with the end result, the wonderful book that you've presented here to us today. And I think also for our broader ERC project, this was important because it gave an alternative perspective at how we can also look at international organizations. I think with the discussions we've had in the team, that really brought the whole project to a higher level. So thank you so much for taking that road. Now, I already mentioned several times that you were working in a broader project, in a team. You, me, Maria, who's sitting there, Giuseppe and Leonard, and later Farzan, who are undoubtedly following this via live stream. And teamwork was really something you found important, and you paid attention to. I mean, after 3 months, you took us all to a trip to Aachen, right before the COVID, to the Christmas, the Weihnachtsmarkt, over there to drink the glue wine and experience a very nice moment together. And I think the team was always the reference point throughout your appointment, even if the scholarship was individual. Now, much of your PhD trajectory, and it was already alluded to during the discussion, was interrupted by COVID. And I recall that you already booked your accommodation and your trip to go to Bonn to do actual interviews in March at the headquarters of UNFCCC. That had to be cancelled. But you got really right on continuing your work. Though, nevertheless, you know, it did take some of the joy away from writing the PhD. And I think COVID was also a difficult period for you away from family and friends. Here, Maastricht, really having to dedicate your work to the thesis. But I think you still managed to do really a lot during these years, and I think that really speaks to your character, how you managed to address that challenge. And I really want to give here two very nice positive examples of how you turn it around. I think, first of all, you were always quite motivated to do a visiting fellowship at a different university to also get a bit of a sense of how things go elsewhere, to get additional intellectual stimulus. And Professor Thomas Sommerer here kindly agreed to host you in Potsdam. Now that was really during the last bits of the Omicron variant and lockdown, but you managed to bring your theoretical thinking to a higher level while being hosted at Potsdam. So I think that was a very good decision from your side, and I think we're also very grateful to the colleagues over there for hosting you. I'm still very happy that, you know, ignoring all the COVID restrictions, I stepped on a plane in January 2022 to visit all of you there. We couldn't do much because obviously a lot were closed, but we did go on a very lovely walk in the cold Potsdam winter weather, and I was happy to see you over there. I think the second thing, and you talked about it obviously during your presentation, is you managed to go to Glasgow to attend the COP meeting over there. And I think that's also something that has stayed with you, because you can obviously do all these interviews via Zoom, but really to walk around at that event where history is being made or not being made, to see the engagement of civil society, the NGOs, in addition to the representatives. I think that was really, I think, important for you, and I think it's very good that you went there. I mean, perhaps for the public, not everybody can walk into that meeting. You really have to go through serious accreditation, apply for it very much in advance, and you went through the trouble to do that, and I think it really shows in your thesis and in your thinking about climate change. Now, you've graduated here today, but you already started a new job, you know, a couple of months back. I think they're very lucky to have you in Kiel, and I wish you also very much all the best in the next steps of your academic career. Congratulations on a fantastic book in defense. Dr. Laura van Allwörden.
Dear Doctor, sounds good, huh? Dear Dr. van Allwörden, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. We will now still take photos here and on the stairs, and then we will celebrate in the Refter and toast to you. Well done. Congratulations.